During the latter half of his long life, he was often called the greatest American composer, with a musical language all his own and a unique ability to sound far more avant-garde in terms of techniques than he actually was. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Elliott Carter. Elliott Cook Carter Jr. was born in December 1908 in New York. His father, Elliott Carter Sr., was a lace importer, and the family was quite well off, with a summer home in Connecticut, yearly travels to Europe, and private tutoring for Elliott Jr. He would become fluent in French, German, Italian, and Greek, and he had passing knowledge of several others, including Flemish and Romansh. His parents enrolled him in piano lessons when he was about 9, but he didn't really enjoy music until high school, which was at the Horace Mann School in the Bronx. A well-to-do school to be sure, but not quite as racist or prejudiced as the competition, which was nice. The music teacher there was a man named Clifton Furness, who was friends with Charles Ives. The three of them became an odd group of friends when Furness introduced Carter to Ives in 1924, and Ives wrote a letter of recommendation for Carter that helped land him at Harvard in 1926, which cited Carter's, quote, instinctive interest in literature and especially music. And like any good salesman, the Carters apparently actually also bought insurance from Ives as well. Furness, funnily enough, for his part, was only a teacher at Horace Mann because he had written to Ives asking him about his Concord Sonata, and at that point Ives didn't get a lot of fan mail from people who actually were interested in his work, so he was able to give Clifton a little bit of a boost. Carter, who was deeply resentful of his parents' dissatisfaction towards a career in music, privately corresponded with Ives in the late 1920s while he was still at Harvard. And Ives encouraged the youngster, but Carter would not return the favor. He would come to make it very clear what he thought of Ives' music, and let's say that they went through periods of fundamental aesthetic disagreement. We're going to get to that in just a second. Despite his interest in music having awoken in high school, he actually didn't spend a whole lot of time with it hands-on at Harvard. He didn't study it in undergrad, he studied English instead. He also studied the oboe, but that was over at the nearby Langy School, and he only took one music class in undergrad, and he got a C in it. To Carter, the Harvard musical culture was hopelessly backwards and conservative in its outlook. In summer 1927, Carter traveled to Tunisia on a project to transcribe Arabic music, and in 1928 we have his first surviving composition, the James Joyce setting, My Love is in a Light Attire. Its bitonality and other modernistic traits are probably what saved it from being destroyed. In it, Carter also did something that he would often come to do, quote one of the earliest pieces of music we have notated, the ancient Greek psychelos song. This was the beginning of Carter's long journey towards finding a musical aesthetic. He also loved the works of Alfred North Whitehead, not a composer, but a philosopher who stressed organicism and the idea of time as a perception of continuous change, and these are both things that would define Carter's mature style. Whitehead's magnum opus, Process and Reality, was pleasure reading for Carter, and he got a lot out of it, but it was so dense that most people would find it so hard to digest, like a 150-year-old fruitcake. Carter graduated from Harvard, again having officially studied English, but then he stayed on at Harvard to study music at the master's level. Now you think this would be really strange. He didn't like the undergrad program, and also, like, there wasn't a whole lot of music that he did that could be recorded on a transcript, but nevertheless, he stuck around at Harvard and he studied under Walter Piston and, of all people, Gustav Holst. But he still didn't really have a good command of composition, and his biggest influence was his study with Nadia Boulanger in Paris, and Piston suggested that he go there primarily because he spoke French, and so he'd have less trouble acclimating than other American expatriates. He went over in 1932, meaning that he actually missed the first performance of his music anywhere when the Harvard Classical Club did a piece in March 1933. The problem was that for all of Boulanger's connections, Carter did not thrive under her tutelage like other composers did. There's a common misconception about Carter that he endured periods of poverty, and this simply isn't true. Like, he got his allowance yanked from him when he went to Paris because, again, his parents didn't like the idea of him studying music, especially abroad, so he was short of funds when he was overseas, but he was never poor in the sense that he was never wanting for money. Like, he came from a pretty rich background. The problem is that Carter was always kind of a reserved guy, so if someone had a misconception about him in his personal life, he wasn't the kind of person who would go and correct the record. In any event, Boulanger did what she always did with her students. She grilled him on 16th century counterpoint, and together with the other students, he would sing through the cantatas of Johann Sebastian Bach. Carter went on to say that his Boulanger-era works were mostly inspired by Sergei Prokofiev, and he didn't really keep many of them around. And likewise, Boulanger spoke highly of his musicianship and of his penmanship, but not his compositional chops, per se. Okay, so the famous Mademoiselle might not have been as helpful to Carter as she was for other musicians, but no matter, it still helped Carter in the sense that he started thinking of his music in a much more contrapuntal direction. For Boulanger, counterpoint was music in the sense that it was about making the right decisions. And counterpoint, good counterpoint, meant that you had control over your life. It was like a character flaw, if you will, to her. If you came in with a couple of parallel fifths, it meant that your life was in disarray and you needed to get your act together, not on a musical level, but on a personal level as well. Expanding that concept outwards, you begin to think of composition as a series of choices, and it's imperative on the composer to make the right choice at the right time. Boulanger was not a fan of Arnold Schoenberg or Bela Bartok or anything more dissonant than Stravinsky. Carter wrote several early works that, in his words, attempted to, quote, Americanize this French style, but he would soon realize that he needed to write differently. Specifically, Carter loved Henry Cowell's book New Musical Resources, which was originally published in 1930, and he began developing some theoretical ideas based on that text. Cowell wanted this book to plant the seeds of continued modernist innovation, and Carter took to innovative approaches to meter and rhythm. Cowell was confident that music needed to evolve and embrace new forms, something that Carter took as a challenge and accepted. He also took after the music of Edgar Varèse, specifically in how the French expatriate's rhythmic approach mimicked, to Carter's ear, the patterns of spoken speech. The ideas of simultaneous layers and complex textures have their seeds here, but we're a long ways away from them actually coming to fruition. Having returned to New York in the late 1930s, Carter found a world divided. Although everyone was still reeling from the effects of the Great Depression, especially artists, composers were still heavily divided among ideological lines. You had more conservative composers like Aaron Copland and Samuel Barber and David Diamond, who constituted the League of Composers, while more avant-garde acts were part of the International Composers Guild. And this latter group was beset with some anti-Semitic attitudes, and it had funding from an increasingly hard to get a hold of Ives, and it was stuttering, and while anyone familiar with Carter's music might think that he would have been a part of the wilder crowd, think again. Not only was Carter part of this more conservative group, he actually wrote for their journal, Modern Music, in the late 1930s through early 1940s. Carter's tendency to really hit you with the hot takes is something that threatened to really get him in some significant degree of hot water, especially because it wasn't wise for someone whose career hadn't really gotten started to go up trying to make enemies in the press. You could argue that's why Cesar Cui of the Mighty Handful never really got any traction as a composer. The editor of Modern Music, Minna Lederman, nicknamed him Fighting Kid Carter, and it's in the very pages of this journal when Carter would rip into Ives. My boy. Carter was very specifically disappointed in Ives' Concord Sonata, as he found that score, which most people even today find bewildering, to be conventional. And later he would walk back some of his statements, which is only fair because many examples of his mature music is positively Ivesian in conceptualization and approach on a nuts and bolts level. But he never actually recanted the critiques, like he still stood by what he said, even though later on he would come to emphasize the positive traits that he identified in other parts of the article instead of the negative ones. But he identified Ives as a composer for whom many of his pieces, to Carter's ear, were, quote, more original than good. What Carter disagreed with was Ives' general nostalgic sense of Americana, his willingness to quote a whole bunch of tunes from the vernacular in order to get that Americana sense across. And he also said that Ives' harmonies, dissonant as they were, didn't actually go anywhere formally. They were just dissonances, essentially for the sake of dissonances. But while Carter was not someone who would say, quote, a Stephen Foster tune, like Ives would often do, he would have instrumental groups doing different things, or he would layer things, or even do some quotations, sometimes of Ives' music itself. And by 1944, Carter had changed his tune on Ives again and rephrased his critiques into something that emphasized Ives' role as a forebear of the rest of American music. But at that point, they were never in contact again. Ives was in the last decade of his life, and his wife Harmony increasingly served as a gatekeeper for the increasingly frail, now long retired composer. Carter was aware that he hadn't proven consistent in his critique and assessment of Ives, and he would later say that even though his opinions of Ives' music did change over the years, and he emphasized the goods versus the bads in different ways, his opinion of Ives as a person, as a human being with whom he interacted, had never changed, and he always had respect for him in that regard. But if actions speak louder than words, and I believe that they do, Carter was incredibly influential in saving Ives' music and bringing some of his best pieces to light. It was Carter who saved The Unanswered Question and Central Park in the Dark from photostat copies and arranged for official performances of them. Now, was Carter at this point in his career himself a composer of note? Not really. His problem seems to have been a biting self-criticism, and he was not afraid to turn that cannon on others. He destroyed many pieces, with a handful that survive mostly choral works, although from this early period in his career we do have two major surviving ballet scores, Pocahontas and The Minotaur. But he got some professional help from the best man at his wedding, one Nicholas Nabokov, who helped Carter get some performances and even helped him into his first teaching position at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. Carter's wife Helen encouraged him to take it too, as she must have thought it would have provided a sense of stability for his career, and Carter then left after like 2 years because he wanted to work on his stuff. But in 1946 he found himself in nearby Baltimore at the Peabody Conservatory, and then he left there, and basically he was known for suddenly leaving teaching positions because he wanted to travel or do something else, up until 1970. It must be noted that Helen Carter was an independent woman, who was known for basically running their household in its entirety and rather strictly managed access to her husband. I know at least one composer who was personally and severely disrespected by her abrasive attitude towards letters expressing interest in Carter's music or merely asking a simple question. Elliott Carter could be, as mentioned, very reserved, and he was supremely distrustful of interviewers who wanted to dig into his personal life, and he would often omit, misdirect, or even lie about facets of his life, largely with the result of wanting as much privacy as possible. Anything beyond his intellectual or artistic pursuits just was not relevant. Those who knew Elliott, and who would later met Helen, would often say something along the lines of, "Oh dear, there are two of them." In 1946, Carter came out with what proved to be his first big piece, the Piano Sonata. This piece is succinctly described as neoclassical and pandiatonic, and Carter linked the idea of neoclassicism to a rejection of German expressionism, which many in the artistic circles of the day had felt contributed to the rise of Hitler. This was the culmination of the early works, which are broadly in this American style. During the Depression, the arts were more government-funded than they ever had been before, and so there was some social pressure to produce works that had popular appeal. This was the era, after all, of Copland's rise to fame, but with Ives' work still unknown, composers were trying to build an American style of art anew in this generation just as they had in the last. There was no consensus and there was no continuation, and Carter identified this as the key difference between American and European artists. European artists were aware of their place in the tradition, whereas American artists were never looking to their own past to build off of that to something new. They were always trying to recreate music or whatever form of art in each successive generation. The Piano Sonata's central concept was generated by what Carter identified as the total sound of the piano writing. Far from the rigor of total serial control, which was taking over in Europe, Carter's music is much more neo-romantic in its approach. It has a very free approach to rhythm, and it's this full-throated romantic playing style that embraces the sonority of the instrument and what it can do. The first measures embrace the piano's resonant properties and the pianist's finger dexterity. He came to the piece with the idea that the very nature of the instrument and its performer would determine the musical content and shape, and the Piano Sonata appeared when there were relatively few large-scale pieces written for the instrument. Its accessibility has made it a staple since its 1947 premiere. While modernist piano music was cutting against the grain of sonority, preferring to craft the shorter, more pointillistic pieces in the style of arch-serialist Anton Webern, Carter's sonata is lyrical and deeply accessible, while showing a broad handling of form and a deep analytical rigor. While this stylistically differs wildly from later pieces, we see the beginnings of Carter as a composer primarily concerned with dialogue, how instruments and individual lines within an instrument fit together. The sonata does exhibit many properties that we can, after the fact, identify as Elliott Carter, but it's still a long ways away from his mature style. This is the final piece of Carter's where we get a fully prefabricated form as part of the overall piece. He was always searching for new ways to think about form, and so the last time he used one of these prefab forms was the fugue that appears in the second movement. It also actually has key centers, although calling the piece tonal is getting a bit much, but the point is that he set up B and A sharp as these conflicting poles, and the overtones that they produced would be set into conflict as well. So a lot of the upper motion is determined by a switching between these two very tonally distant, even though they're right next to each other on the piano, key centers. And he crafts a large-scale form out of this conflict, which is something that you see a lot in a lot of his later music as well. Carter also described the piano sonata as existing in 3 movements instead of the notated 2, and this is the first time that we see him applying different forms at different levels. There's a conflict not just in tonal areas and the B versus the A sharp, but also the 3 against 2 meta tempo, if you will, of the movement structures. Yet despite his best efforts, Carter was not happy with the music that was designed to please audiences, and what's more, audiences apparently weren't too pleased either. One critic wrote of his 1939 ballet score Pocahontas as being so thick that you could not see the dancers on the stage. In 1948, Aaron Copland wrote an article citing the best of the next generation of American musicians, and while he did mention John Cage and Leonard Bernstein, he also mentioned a lot of composers who you just don't hear about today at all, and Carter was not mentioned whatsoever. At this point, Copland was well aware of the existence of Carter's music, but he regarded Carter as a choral composer. Primarily, that's what he did. The piano sonata notwithstanding, that was a real exception in his work at that point, and he still lacked a major premiere, especially an orchestral one. It's kind of logical from that perspective that Copland was a guy who felt that Carter was, might have potential, but at that point he wasn't worth mentioning. And this is despite the fact that it was Copland who was trying to get Serge Koussevitzky to do a piece of Carter's for orchestra. Koussevitzky commissioned and performed plenty of contemporary music, but he declined to play Carter's works pretty consistently, even when Copland recommended him, even though Carter was not writing in a dissimilar idiom to those more conservative composers at that point. On a personal level, you might disagree, but listen to, say, the Holiday Overture by Carter and compare it to a similar orchestral work by, say, Aaron Copland. To me, Carter's music comes across as inauthentic. Like, he's writing in this style, but it's not really the style that he wants to be writing in. Copland's writing in this pan-diatonic American open sound because it's what he wanted to write. Like, that was part of his innate style. Whereas Carter's music seems less driven to be the way that it is. The Holiday Overture was actually written for Koussevitzky to conduct with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and he was actually required to do this because it won a contest, and that was the prize, but Koussevitzky kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, and eventually Carter got so fed up that he snuck into the orchestral library and snuck the parts out for a different performance, because he just couldn't wait on them any longer. Carter would soon move away from neoclassicism, and he described it as, quote, a masquerade in a bomb shelter, unquote. And he cited, like a lot of composers did who embraced it and then moved away from it or didn't embrace it at all, as something that did not capture the needs of the time, the horrors that had been wrought and the world that had changed in a post-World War II world. In 1948, Carter came out with his Cello Sonata, which is another stepping stone towards his mature music technique-wise. It's a far more stylistically defining piece than the Piano Sonata because instead of having 2 key centers going at one another with one instrument, he actually has the cello and the piano doing completely different things the entire time. Their expressive moods are completely divorced from one another, and this is especially true in the first movement. The cello is playing this very lyrical line, and the piano is just plunking away metronomically like a clock. Carter plays with the distinction between these 2 instruments as though they're separate entirely. After all, they are indeed separate instruments. Why try to fuse the 2 together? So that's exactly what he did. And ironically, there's only one thing that they seem to share in analysis of the piece, and that is a quote from Charles Ives, my boy. We also see in this piece a systematic approach to tempo and his first use of his personal version of set theory in order to construct his harmonies. His tempo relationships between different sections of the piece were all worked out proportionally, and the prime factors between them were all a very small set of numbers. And in terms of harmony, he was beginning to focus more and more on peculiar constructions particular to the intricacies of 12-tone equal temperament, specifically the all-interval tetrachord, which I mentioned in my video on set theory, and this allows maximum compositional freedom while remaining rigorously tied down to some kind of overarching system. Finally, it seems, when he was 40 years old, Carter had struck the balance between conservatism and modernism that he'd been seeking up until that point. And the cello sonata was the final piece of his that actually used a key signature. In 1950, Carter received a Guggenheim grant to work on something that he wanted to work on, so he moved out to Tucson, Arizona, and he wrote his first string quartet out in the desert. He didn't like the kind of systematized composition that the serialists were pursuing, and yet he needed some kind of mathematical backbone to make sure his pieces had some kind of coherence and structure. The first quartet was, in Carter's own words, a response to the idea that music was for others in addition to oneself. And so he decided to write a work interesting to himself and that encapsulated everything that he knew how to do in all of his unique theories. But this is a sleight of hand on Carter's part. He framed this piece as though it were the beginning of his career, the piano sonata and the cello sonata and the early ballet scores and all the other minor works from his early period notwithstanding. Carter intimated that all those pieces were compromised from what they could be due to outside pressures, that he felt like he needed to appeal to a performer or the audience or something else. From an ideological perspective, Carter, like the serialists, didn't think that Arnold Schoenberg's 12-tone technique had gone far enough, but instead of taking after Webern's model and serializing everything, Carter looked to Schoenberg's role as the emancipator of dissonance and applied it more broadly, not to pitches, but to entire pieces, and specifically to their rhythmic content. And this came about in a technique known as metric modulation, a term coined by Richard Franco Goldman, but Carter preferred to call it tempo modulation, which is technically more accurate, but it isn't alliterative. Carter had first worked out some of these problems in the 8 pieces for 4 timpani, which originally only comprised 6 pieces. Carter then later added 2 for pedal timpani to make the set of 8 we now know, but curiously said that only a maximum of 4 should be played at any one time. These were compositional etudes in that rhythm, and the juxtaposition of different rhythmic layers was the primary concern. In the strictest nuts and bolts fashion, metric modulation is about setting up a rhythmic value within a tempo, and then across a bar line making the duration of one particular note value equal to the duration of a new one. So you could have the old quarter note becoming the new quarter note triplet, or the old septuplet 16th becoming the new quintuplet 16th, if you want to be a little more complicated about it. The reason the idea of metric modulation is a little bit of a misnomer is that you don't really hear meter in his mature work. The bar lines are really only there for alignment between players. The idea was to divorce tempo from the regularities of meter. The unusual form of the first quartet interpolates pauses not at movement breaks, but at points where the tempo is stable, and he does this pretty specifically so that the metric modulations could be heard. I mean, if you break off the music in one tempo and you start up in another, which is the typical way in which music is constructed if it's in multiple movements, that destroys the idea of tempo modulation, of setting up one tempo and then gradually, through the manipulation of different note values, ending up in a different rhythmic and metrical world. So if you pause it at places where the rhythm is stable and the meter is stable, then you're basically putting in random pauses in a piece that is through composed, and you're really highlighting the fact that tempo modulation is now taking the place of harmonic modulation in traditional music. Carter expanded this Schoenbergian emancipation of the dissonance to an emancipation of musical discourse as a whole, which extended not just to rhythm, but also to register. Carter said that the idea behind metric modulation went as far back as medieval France, particularly the ars subtilior style of the 1300s. And the complexity in purely rhythmic terms of this music rivaled the complexity of the serialists some 600 years later. John Cage flatly called Carter's approach not experimental, just, quote, putting a new wing on the academy, unquote. Carter hit back by comparing Cage's antics to Charlie Chaplin and other comics of the silent film age. Carter was deeply skeptical about Cage's use of chance procedures specifically. The first quartet is kind of a masterclass in what makes Carter Carter. It's the idea of simultaneous layers. You can analyze the piece using a couple of different devices and you can get totally different and totally valid forms. They're all superimposed. There are different streams that are working at different tempos, and so you have this total conflict where the instruments don't really seem to be totally together, but they're still written so that they do line up, even though they don't really quite line up. It's a real hallmark of his style. For bigger pieces like the double concerto, this rhythmic layering would inform the structure of an entire piece, and this is something called a structural polyrhythm. The idea behind a structural polyrhythm is that you would have this large mathematical ratio that would determine the relationships of all the foreground elements. He explored this idea pretty consistently from the Concerto for Orchestra onwards. He would also experiment with spatialization, the idea of putting different musical ensembles and groups in different places around a hall or space, in the same way that Ives did, but more along the lines of what some of the European modernists like Karlheinz Stockhausen were doing in pieces such as Gruppen. For the second string quartet, he specified that the players were to be further apart on the stage than usual, and for the third, split the quartet into two chunks that were playing on opposite sides of the stage. You know, I just cannot believe that Elliott Carter predicted social distancing. He's truly the Nostradamus of our time. Beginning with the second quartet, he also experimented with a technique where he assigned different players a certain bank of rhythms or intervals, which would further stratify the musical content, and that you might have, the second violin could, for instance, this is not specifically to the quartet, but you could say that, you write a piece where that line would be entirely in quintuplets, and these characteristic broken tuplets that you see oftentimes in his music, but also that the music itself had to move within the structure of that one line. It can only move by a certain set of intervals. So in the double concerto, which is a better example because I'm not just speaking off the top of my head here, you have the piano and the harpsichord who have totally different intervallic content. I believe it's the harpsichord is playing more minor versions of the intervals, and the piano which is playing the more major versions of those same intervals. So the minor second is the realm of the harpsichord, and the major second is the realm of the piano. And with the third quartet, legend has it that the Juilliard string quartet, who premiered it, spent an entire day on the first measure alone. And that's because in the third quartet you have two pairs, and these pairs of instruments are playing off against one another, and they have different movement structures, and they have completely different characterizations based on interval controls and rhythmic controls and all sorts of stuff. So you're basically trying to play in line with what your partner's doing on that side, but across the room, across the stage from you, you have two other musicians who you're used to being very close to, and you have to play something completely different from them. It's turned into a bit of a crowd pleaser, because once you get the sense that these two pairs are doing different things, then you can actually kind of get into it. What Carter felt were truly representative works started around the time of the second quartet, written when he was about 50 years old, so no one expected, though, that this wouldn't even be the halfway point in his life. Carter once wrote that he thought of every piece as representing a kind of crisis in his life, but by the 1950s, he started to relax this idea, and instead he characterized each piece as crystallizing his mindset at a very specific moment in time, such that he couldn't write the same piece later on. If his mindset changed, if his mood changed, that would inform how the piece was structured and how it sounded. No matter how you want to slice it, each work is such a thorough exploration of the sounds and the structures inherent in the instruments themselves, because as far back as the Piano Sonata, he's pulling ideas out of the ensemble itself. Like, the ensemble is the first consideration for one of his pieces, and then the kind of background structures and harmonies became sort of a secondary concern. And whenever you're exploring something so thoroughly, like if he had a specific set, a specific tetrachord he was wanting to explore, and he would thoroughly exploit all of its combinations over the course of a piece. He was not thrilled with the idea of returning to a specific instrument or specific genre immediately after writing the last piece, which accounts for the huge distance of time between his two major piano pieces, the Piano Sonata and the Night Fantasies of 1980, which we're going to get to in a second. This indicated that he was particularly involved with the human element of music, and for that reason he was never drawn to electronic synthesis. He didn't reject it out of hand, he didn't think it was bad necessarily, but he didn't feel like it was something that he could write well in. He had the same relationship to a lot of extended techniques and novel sounds that composers were producing, and he felt like, well, it was all well and good if you could use them, but a lot of composers were so focused on generating new sounds and making unique sound objects that existed in the course of a piece that they were so focused on the small scale and the craft of the orchestration or this extended technique or this tuning or this microtonal system that they lost track of the form and the musical discourse as a whole. This is similar to how another long-lived composer, Leo Ornstein, regarded the orchestra as providing so many colors that composers got bogged down in the sound without writing substantive music, and that was Ornstein's reason why he wrote a lot of piano pieces. Carter's eventual fame, which grew throughout the 1950s, sprang from the 1954 premiere of his first string quartet. But his fame was always among those who were in the know, because at this point there was a huge gap that was forming between popular American musical culture and high art music and contemporary classical music. And Carter's fame was in that world, not so much in the popular zeitgeist. And Carter was especially disappointed in how American musical culture had evolved in this direction, because he looked at Europe and he saw that there were new music concerts that were well funded and people were more aware of what was happening in contemporary art music. Ironically, in part due to the efforts of the CIA, who were funding concerts over there, but that wasn't known until much later. Things changed in the 60s. I mean, you had the National Endowment for the Arts, you had more new music ensembles that were specifically devoted to that in New York City, so it started to change a little bit, but the arts were still less funded in America than they were in Europe. For a while, even though Carter's music was gaining traction and fame, both in the United States and Europe, he was kind of in a musical no man's land, because there were plenty of European musicians who saw his music, saw that it wasn't serial and weren't really interested in it, because he wasn't really part of the Darmstadt school of these ultra-serialist composers in Europe, but he also wasn't writing in this accessible Coplandesque Americana style anymore, so he really wasn't getting the fame, and he really wasn't being played by American orchestras either. That was a recurring problem for him. Between the 1950s and 1980s, Carter also didn't write a lot of small pieces, so a lot of his works came more irregularly, and they were major works, but he only wrote like one a year, pretty much. Supermetrical styles of music were incomprehensible to Carter because he really didn't feel like that reflected the times. He identified the speed of music as being the speed of culture, right? So in the 18th century, you had music that went about as fast as an army marching across a field. But in the 20th century, you had jet airplanes, and music had to go at that speed. Also, he was not a composer who was just informed by other composers. He was informed by, for instance, the writings of James Joyce and the French writer Marcel Proust. Far from being a composer who only knew of music, he consistently made other cultural, literary, and philosophical references, from Plato to mathematics to filmmaking. The films of Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein were another important touchstone for Carter, as they play with time. Eisenstein in particular was essentially the inventor of the montage, which cut between different things that were going on at the same time, and this really messes with your sense of time. And Eisenstein was actually known for using musical terminology to describe how these montages were assembled in his films, because Eisenstein knew that music was something that could play with your perception of time, and this is something he filtered into his films, which in turn Carter picked up on and tried to apply back into music. Carter was opposed to 12-tone music on a couple of bases. One was that you couldn't repeat a pitch until you actually sounded all the other pitches, which he felt to be kind of an arbitrary concern and didn't actually contribute to the feeling of a piece lacking a key center in any significant way. But he also didn't like the idea of inversional equivalency, the idea that, say, a minor second and a major seventh would be the same thing and should be treated as such. They don't sound like the same thing, so why should they be treated as such? He concluded that serial composers did not think of their music harmonically. They thought much more horizontally than they did vertically. So of particular importance to Carter, as mentioned previously, is this all-interval tetrachord, but also there's the all-triad hexachord and the all-interval 12-tone chord. And in this, all 12 notes of the chromatic scale are arranged harmonically in such a way that every interval from the minor second to the major seventh can be found between any two consecutive notes. Carter was not a 12-tone composer in the sense that he wasn't working with rows and sets in the same way that those composers were, but he was a 12-tone composer in the sense that he was always keenly aware of the total chromatic aggregate. He was just working with it in a different system. A lot of his mature music routinely exploits all 12 pitch classes and intervals between them in some systematic way. In 1942, when he was applying for a job in the Office of War Information, one of Carter's friends described him in a letter as a mathematician, which is kind of ironic considering that he wasn't, at least not by training. But he had a very mathematical mind, and the processes that went into his music are really complex. He did an enormous amount of pre-compositional work in terms of just graphs and numbers before anything note was put onto paper at all. Like, he was focused on the purely mathematical side of his rhythmic and harmonic constructions before he considered how that would relate to pitches. Yeah, and despite this heady calculation, he was also being critical of composers who put too much calculation into their music, so yeah, I don't know how he squared that in his head. He called serialism a stultifying intellectual poverty, and how exactly these graphs and calculations made it into his work is a matter of debate. It's not entirely clear, in part because he would also use this scratch paper to write down random stuff like a telephone number. So, what exactly is and isn't musically related, it's really hard to say. What we do know is that even though he used a similar bank of techniques and he had a certain harmonic language and a certain rhythmic language, he did think of all of his pieces as existing individualistically, like you needed to create a coherent musical grammar and a structure for each piece. While the materials of each piece might be different, he did have overlapping concepts when it came to segmenting musical space. For instance, in the Concerto for Orchestra, he was splitting the ensemble up not by timbre, which a lot of composers might do in terms of like brass versus winds versus strings, but by range instead. Despite his differences with serialist composers, he was stuck looped in with these kind of academically minded composers in New York, such as Milton Babbitt and Stefan Volpa. And while Carter supported Volpa financially when Parkinson's destroyed his teaching career, he regarded Babbitt's music with utter mystification as to its appeal. Of Babbitt's famous/infamous piece, Philomel, for soprano electronics, Carter said that it was a wonderful story, but Babbitt was just going on beep beep in the background. And these three composers, despite their differences, were the uptown composers because they were ultimately continuers of some tradition in some way, compared to the downtown composers, which consisted of overt experimentalists such as John Cage or Earl Brown or Morton Feldman. Why have different instruments doing different things at the same time, something that goes all the way back to the cello sonata? Well, part of that was Carter conceived of the instruments in an ensemble as citizens in a democracy. His use of spatialization and of splitting different instruments up in terms of characterization is what he called creating an auditory scenario, or a drama, if you will, to be played out on the stage and without words. The complexity of these different streams of musical thought is hampered by the size of the ensemble. So you really can't have a polyrhythm of 4 against 2, that's just 16th notes against 8th notes. But you could have a polyrhythm of 2 against 3 against 5 against 7. And if you expand this outward to the structure of a piece, and then you don't play all the notes at the same time when they would align, you have different instruments playing at different speeds with different characteristics, which is exactly what he wanted. But the problem is you can't really do the 7 layer when it comes to orchestral writing. It just becomes way too complicated. So when his orchestral pieces, usually you're going to have a prime factor of at most 5, and his solo and chamber pieces, the prime factor is going to be at most 7. One of the cool things about the metric modulation technique is that you can have a certain line which is consistently renotated so it looks like it's speeding up and slowing down, but because of the metric modulations, it's actually staying at a consistent pulse. The reason that you would change how it's notated is not for the sake of that one continuous line, but so that everything around it can be recontextualized rhythmically. He does this, a great example of this is the oboes in his song Sandpiper from his song cycle, A Mirror on Which to Dwell. The oboe is constantly being renotated, but there's all this stuff going on around it which has different metrical relationships to that oboe pulse. He actually does this quite a bit in all these later vocal pieces. Carter took a long break from writing vocal music because he started out writing these choral pieces for the Harvard Glee Club, and he moved away from that for many, many years. But in the late 70s and early 80s, he came out with a series of 3 song cycles for voice and chamber ensembles on various different poets. And he loved the use of these obbligato instruments, these it's not just accompaniment, but it's actually a line that, along with the vocalist, engages in a kind of contrapuntal dialogue. And this is something that he pulled directly out of his study of Bach cantatas with Nadia Boulanger. In these pieces, Carter, unusually for a composer, did not leave himself room to comment upon the text. There are no interludes, preludes, postludes. It starts and it ends, and it's the poet, not the composer, who actually has the final say in the expressive nature of the text. It's kind of weird that for all of his interest in voice over the years, his engagement with poets early and late, and his use of characterization and spatialization and auditory dramas, you'd think he'd be a prolific opera composer, but he only ever wrote one opera, this kind of strange entry in the genre called What Next? Night Fantasies, his second and final work for solo piano, dates from 1980, and Carter cited this work as one of continual change and metamorphosis, what he called a certain, quote, poetic moodiness, unquote. As evidence of his epic industriousness, the sketches for this piece total over 1,000 pages. The structural polyrhythm that undergirds this piece is a whopping 218 to 175, while harmonically the piece is based on an all-interval collection of the 12 tones. Within this structure, Carter provided himself with an enormous sense of freedom. But it's important to note that he didn't just create a polyrhythm and call it a day. He utilized smaller structures that were all in some way linked to this overall polyrhythm. And that 1,000-page sketch business is nothing compared to the second string quartet. Over 2,000 pages of sketches exist for that. And that's only a fraction of these 17,000 pages of sketches that grace the Library of Congress, not to mention the other materials at the Paul Sacker Foundation in Basel, Switzerland. When the pianist Ursula Oppens, one of the 4 dedicatees of Night Fantasies, asked Carter about a seeming lack of rhythmic regularity in a certain section, Carter replied that he intentionally covered up the system, the big polyrhythm at that point, because it struck him as being too mechanical. So in many ways, Night Fantasies is a culmination of his late style and the beginning of his late style, an intentional paring down of his musical resources to write smaller pieces which were less intensely focused on exploiting all the particular harmonic possibilities of what he set up as the musical language. This was especially true of his music that he wrote after 1990. There's this conscious paring down of his musical elements, or an integration of smaller pieces within larger pieces, or the extraction of pieces from others. Like, he's not thinking of his music at that point as each piece having its own refined musical grammar. Some of these pieces are too short to really have their own audible system and structure. Rather, these pieces all are really kind of refractions of the same thing, because instead of working with really complicated set classes and pitch materials, instead of pulling from what he had come to call his harmony book, which is something that he had added to since about the third quartet onwards, he intentionally, again, pared that back and focused on a series of charts based on the all-interval tetrachord that had been really important for his second quartet. And part of the reason for this change in style in this late period has to do with his own health. His hearing was going, he had slow-growing prostate cancer, his wife Helen had Lyme disease. There's a lot of reasons as to why he would not want to write pieces that were nearly as complicated as he'd done before. The use of familiar gestures across pieces, what Carter identified in his language metaphor as morphological elements across pieces, contribute to his increase in production post-1990. A sense of progression and audible connection within the music is also a primary concern in a lot of Carter's music. Carter didn't see much use for music that didn't give the audience members something to grab onto as they went through the course of a listening experience. Regardless of his music's technical complexity, Carter was always careful to cast himself as a fundamentally intuitive composer. While he was concerned with grammar and syntax, he claimed that he was not consciously aware of these things when composing. I find this kind of hard to believe, considering how many sketches he left with every piece. And another story is the premiere of his clarinet quintet in April 2008. There was a mid-concert talk, and Carter talked about how the intervallic nature of the piece, the structure, if you will, the very DNA of the piece is embedded in the intervals that are heard at the very outset. But then he said that not only was this not something he expected audiences to hear, he couldn't even hear it. That there was that underlying connection, it gave the piece a certain sense of form and structure and coherence, but it wasn't meant to be heard. Carter wrote music without fail every morning until his death in November 2012, about a month shy of his 104th birthday. He'd finished his last piece, a piano trio called Epigrams, less than 3 months prior. He didn't finalize it for publication. It took a year and a half of work on the part of 3 Carter experts to finalize what decisions remained. Carter was someone who would walk out of the concert hall if an orchestra played too much of a standard repertoire composer like Beethoven. And he was not above referring to himself as arrogant. And in fact, the only composer he ever actually had devotion to his entire life, in the sense that he never said anything bad about this composer, was Roger Sessions. His strained relationship to American orchestras is best summed up in a story where, in March 1984, he felt disparaged by comments made by Leonard Slatkin and left the concert hall. Carter was especially despondent about the state of orchestra's attitudes towards new music, in part because he was salty about how they treated him over the years. He identified the greatest orchestrators of the early 20th century as those who had up-close and personal connections to orchestras, but contemporary expenditures of time and rehearsal space and just the cost of running a rehearsal versus the cost of performing in an actual concert was just too prohibitive, and that you really could not have that up-close and personal relationship, the back and forth, the give and take between the composer who's trying out new things and immediately getting it performed and then revising it for another performance. That simply didn't exist, and he didn't like it. Part of this was kind of his fault. He liked that his scores looked imposing, at least early on. It would open up a score to a page where the strings would be divided into 40 different parts and then pose with it. And obviously this is going to cause huge problems for rehearsal and performance, and not to mention just reading through the score from the conductor's perspective. So it's understandable from a financial perspective why orchestras weren't interested in doing his early pieces a whole lot. And this technique of specifically dividing the strings up into a large mass and tone clusters, basically, is something that you see in a lot of European composers. So you have György Ligeti or János Xenakis did a lot of this, but actually it was Charles Ives who inspired Carter in this regard, specifically his piece, The 4th of July. My boy. This dissatisfaction with the business of contemporary orchestras actually informed some of his orchestrational choices, such as the use of a concertino ensemble around the piano in his piano concerto. If he required the whole orchestra to play the kind of complicated material that he wanted the accompaniment to play, then you really would never get a performance. But instead, if you said, okay, well, these not even a dozen instruments featuring the piano, but also these other instruments that are surrounding the piano, they're going to take the more virtuosic role, and then the simpler stuff, less polyrhythmic, more accompanimental material, the background, if you will. If you think of the piano as the foreground and the concertino as the middle ground and the orchestra as a whole as the background, then the background elements could be a lot more simple, and that you wouldn't require this kind of crazy, dense and virtuosic playing from, the back of the viola section as you would from the solo English horn player up front. There was also the difficulty of achieving a full and balanced tutti and having each instrument within that sound actually be playing in a register that worked for it and that also contributed to the overall texture. Right? There are a lot of instruments in the orchestra, and a lot of them have fairly wide ranges, but they have very specific ranges where they sound really good. And if you put all those instruments in the ranges where they sound really good, some of them are going to overlap. You're going to lose some of the overall effect because it's not as thick as it could be, or you could have a whole section not play and you wouldn't fundamentally change the nature of the sound. He often wrote for smaller ensembles. So the double concerto, for instance, piano and harpsichord, that's really for 2 chamber orchestras, and it's percussion led, because these orchestras, I say orchestras, it's really like a large chamber ensemble really, are facing one another on the stage, and they're each backing up their respective solo instrument. And this was a way for him to achieve a full sound without having to write a note for an instrument that he didn't feel like was contributing to the overall texture. He came up with these solutions to different problems, primarily because of the nature of, again, American orchestras. He didn't have a problem with European orchestras because they were less reliant on ticket sales. And it was Pierre Boulez who first really championed Carter's orchestral music in a significant way, and despite their very different aesthetic approaches, they were kindred spirits. Like Boulez, Carter was uncomfortable with the common orchestrational practice of octave doubling. But while Boulez objected to it as a violation of serial methodology, Carter simply found it awkward in his harmonic language. Boulez and Carter were in many ways 2 sides of the same coin. They were both long-lived composers, thought deeply about where they were in history and the techniques that they were using, And they were also rather inclined to hot takes and writing polemics in their early years. Boulez much more so than Carter, but still, they were willing to speak their minds early on. They shared certain principles even if they approached them from very different angles. Boulez and Carter were always interested in, when they set up a sound world, exploiting everything about it. Boulez said that he never felt like a piece was finished until he had extracted everything he could out of the materials that he'd started out with. And in Carter's case, a lot of it's the same. I mean, the Night Fantasies, structurally, it's not a serial piece, but structurally and how he's exploiting all the different combinations of this all-interval 12-tone chord, it's something that seems like it could come straight out of Boulez. It was study of Boulez's scores that spurred on Carter to make demands of his players that he had theretofore not conceived. In appreciation for Boulez's outsized role in his career, Carter dedicated several pieces to him, and that's in addition to the pieces that Boulez commissioned from Carter. The comparison of various instruments in an ensemble to that of citizens in a democracy, the association with New York City, and the immense personal wealth which freed him from having to write music in order to make a living, all of these things are elements that Carter has in common with Charles Ives. And Carter's most common critiques of his students' works actually echoes Ives' battle cry against European dominance of American music. Carter was really harsh on music that he saw as derivative. For him, each piece needed a reason for existence. As all great teachers do, he got in the heads of his students and figured out what made their music tick, figured out that style, and helped them achieve a better version of what they came into his lessons with. Nevertheless, he always steadfastly refused to provide the names of his students to, say, conductors who would be coming around to Juilliard saying, hey, we want to do a piece of one of your students, give me some good orchestral pieces, and he would always refuse to do that, in part probably because he got fed up with how Boulanger never really liked him as much as the other composers in her studio back in the day. He didn't want to play favorites, and he felt like that would be overt favoritism. However, he did, despite all of his critiques, like he almost never, ever gave compliments to one of his students, but he always diligently showed up to premieres and wrote glowing letters of recommendation. Carter's compositional style was also, like Stravinsky's, atemporal, and while a lot of composers do this, he was systematic about it. What he would do is he wouldn't actually start from the beginning of a piece. He would start with the climax, the loudest, biggest, most intense moment, and he would work outwards from there. Some music also exhibits a kind of cross-cut form. You would have two ideas, but instead of superimposing them on one another, say it's one of his late solo pieces, you would have one idea and then it would cross-cut to another, and then it would then cross-cut back again to the first idea, picking up exactly where that first idea left off. It's almost like flipping across radio stations, and he also pulled this technique from Stravinsky, who used this, as well as a really crude version of metric modulation in his symphonies of wind instruments. What also intrigued Carter about Stravinsky's style was how Stravinsky would develop ideas. One time he witnessed Stravinsky taking an old piece and he cut it up, physically cut it up into small chunks and rearranged it. And Carter was just amazed that this historically significant composer, like the quintessential 20th century artist, would resort to this kind of bricolage method for creating music, and yet it still worked. For all his supremely dissonant and rhythmically challenging music, Carter was actually kind of a conservative composer. His innovations didn't concern performers' relationships to their instruments. It was in the recontextualization of what already existed, what had been a part of Western music since time immemorial. For electronics, he said that he was too fascinated by the machines to write anything good. At a time when American composers moved largely to English for their tempo markings, Carter remained steadfast in his use of Italian. In an avant-garde world of open scores, chants, strict serialism, new tuning systems, new instruments, all sorts of microtones, and extended techniques galore, Carter only took a few spare elements from the world around him. And yet his music is still dense and complex. While Carter may have been joking when he said that his idea of awful was when everybody played together, it's certainly not untrue. Contemporary music in all its varied forms held for Carter an interest that older music could never reach, except minimalism, because he hated minimalism. All a composer can do, Carter once said, is to stick to his own vision, do what he thinks is best, and let the future decide.